Nobody at The Daily Show could believe what they were hearing. For almost 6 months, the production team had been trying to get Keanu Reeves on the show. They'd send emails, make phone calls, and even reach out through mutual contacts in the industry. Every time, the answer was polite but firm. No, thank you. Maybe another time. The schedule doesn't work out. Keanu wasn't known for doing the talk show circuit. Sure, he'd show up when a big movie needed promotion, but even then, he was selective. He didn't do the rounds like other actors, hitting every show in a 2-week media blitz. He picked 1, maybe 2 appearances, and that was it. So when his team kept saying no to The Daily Show, nobody was particularly surprised. Then one Monday morning in September, everything changed. Trevor Noah was sitting in the weekly production meeting, half listening to pitches for upcoming segments while scrolling through news on his phone. The head producer was going through the usual list of potential guests when her phone rang. She glanced at it, frowned, and stepped out of the room to take the call. When she came back 2 minutes later, her face had completely changed. She looked like she'd just won the lottery or seen a ghost, maybe both. The room went quiet. Trevor put his phone down and looked at her with raised eyebrows. She took a breath and said the words nobody expected to hear that day. Keanu Reeves had said yes. The room erupted. People started talking over each other, asking questions, wondering if this was some kind of mistake. Was it really him? Was his publicist sure? When could they schedule it? Trevor just sat back in his chair with a huge grin on his face. He'd been a fan of Keanu for years, not just because of the movies, but because of who he seemed to be as a person. The stories about his kindness and generosity were legendary in Hollywood. Over the next 2 weeks, the team prepared for the interview like they were planning a royal visit. They researched everything about Keanu's career, watched all his recent interviews, and tried to figure out what would make this conversation special. Trevor spent hours thinking about what questions to ask. He didn't want it to be just another promotional interview. He wanted to go deeper, to have a real conversation. The day finally arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. The weather was perfect, one of those early fall days where the air feels crisp and full of possibility. The crew arrived at the studio earlier than usual, everyone buzzing with excitement. Security had been briefed about the high-profile guest, and the production assistants were running around making sure everything was perfect. Around 2 in the afternoon, someone shouted that he was here. People rushed to the windows to catch a glimpse. And there he was, pulling up on a motorcycle. Not a fancy car with tinted windows and a driver, not an SUV full of security personnel. Just Keanu on his bike wearing jeans and a leather jacket, looking like any other guy riding through the city. He parked the motorcycle in the designated spot, took off his helmet and ran his fingers through his hair. Then he did something that immediately won over everyone watching. He walked up to the security guard at the entrance and shook his hand, introducing himself like they were old friends. The guard, a guy named Raymond who'd been working at the studio for 15 years, later said it was one of the most surreal moments of his career. Inside the building, Keanu moved through the hallways with a calm, easy presence. He stopped to talk to the intern carrying coffee, asking her name and how long she'd been with the show. He complimented the set designer on the backdrop for that week's episodes. He thanked the sound technician who was setting up his microphone, asking technical questions about the equipment like he was genuinely interested. Trevor watched all of this on the monitor in his dressing room. He'd seen a lot of celebrities come through the studio over the years. Some were kind, some were difficult, and most were somewhere in between. But there was something different about watching Keanu interact with the crew. It wasn't performative. He wasn't being nice because cameras were rolling or because someone important was watching. He was just being himself. When it was finally time for Trevor and Keanu to meet before the show, the host made his way to the green room. He knocked on the door and heard a friendly voice telling him to come in. Keanu stood up from the couch where he'd been reading a book, not scrolling through his phone like most guests did while waiting. They shook hands, and Trevor felt an immediate sense of ease. They chatted for about 20 minutes before the show started. Trevor later told friends that it was one of the most interesting pre-interview conversations he'd ever had. They talked about everything from motorcycles to philosophy, from comedy to the changing nature of fame in the digital age. Keanu asked Trevor questions about his own life, about what it was like moving from South Africa to America, about his mother and his journey in comedy. What struck Trevor most was how present Keanu was. In a world where everyone seemed distracted, constantly checking their phones or thinking about the next thing. Keanu was fully engaged in the moment. He made eye contact, listened carefully, and responded thoughtfully. It was refreshing in a way that Trevor hadn't quite expected. As they walked toward the stage together, Trevor felt a growing sense that this interview was going to be different. He'd done thousands of interviews by this point in his career. He knew the rhythms, the expected beats, the way these conversations usually unfolded. But something told him that Keanu had come on the show for a reason, beyond just promoting a movie. The stage manager gave them the 2-minute warning. The audience was already seated and buzzing with anticipation. Word had gotten out that Keanu Reeves was the guest, and tickets for that day's taping had become the most sought after in the show's history. People had called in favors, waited in line for hours, and some had even flown in from other cities just for a chance to be in the audience. Trevor took his position at the desk while Keanu waited backstage. The warm-up comedian finished his set and the lights dimmed. The familiar theme music started playing, and the audience erupted in applause. Trevor did his opening monologue, hitting all the jokes he'd written about the day's news, but his mind kept drifting to what was about to happen. Finally, it was time. Trevor gave the introduction, and as Keanu walked out onto the stage, the audience went absolutely wild. People were on their feet clapping and cheering. Keanu smiled, waved, and seemed genuinely touched by the reception. He shook Trevor's hand and they both sat down. The cameras were rolling. The lights were bright. The audience settled into their seats. Trevor opened his mouth to ask the first question, one they'd carefully prepared about Keanu's latest film project. But before he could get the words out, Keanu leaned forward slightly and said something that would change the entire direction of the interview. He said he wanted to talk about something that had been on his mind for a long time. Something important. Something real. Trevor looked at Keanu with a mix of curiosity and surprise. This wasn't how these interviews usually started. Normally there'd be some light banter, a few jokes, maybe a funny story about something that happened on set. Then they'd ease into the promotional material, talk about the movie, show a clip, and wrap it up. But Keanu had just thrown the entire plan out the window, and Trevor could feel the energy in the room shift. The audience seemed to sense it too. The casual chatter and rustling that usually filled the first few moments of an interview died down. People leaned forward in their seats. Even the crew members who'd done this 1,000 times before stopped what they were doing and paid attention. Trevor, being the professional he was, rolled with it. He gestured for Keanu to continue, his expression open and genuinely interested. Whatever was about to happen, he was ready for it. Keanu took a moment, collecting his thoughts, and then he started talking about something nobody expected. He started talking about loneliness. He said he'd been thinking about it a lot lately. Not just his own experiences, but what he'd been observing in the world around him. He talked about riding his motorcycle through cities at night, seeing people walking down streets with their faces buried in their phones, completely disconnected from everything around them. He described subway cars full of people, all sitting inches apart, but nobody making eye contact or acknowledging each other's existence. The way Keanu spoke was captivating. He wasn't giving a rehearsed speech or trying to sound profound. He was just sharing observations, almost like he was thinking out loud. Trevor found himself nodding along, recognizing the truth in what Keanu was saying. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Keanu went on to describe something specific that had happened to him a few months earlier. He'd been in New York, staying at a hotel in Manhattan. Late one night, around 2 a.m, he couldn't sleep, so he decided to go for a walk. The streets were mostly empty, but he passed by a diner that was still open. Through the window, he saw an elderly man sitting alone at a booth, nursing a cup of coffee and staring at nothing in particular. Something about the scene struck Keanu deeply. He went inside, ordered coffee for himself, and asked the man if he could join him. The man looked surprised at first, then wary, probably wondering if this was some kind of setup or prank. But Keanu just stood there with his coffee, waiting for an answer, and eventually the man nodded. They sat together for almost 2 hours. The man's name was Richard, and he'd been coming to that diner 3 or 4 times a week for the past 5 years, always sitting in the same booth. His wife had passed away, his kids lived in different states, and he found it hard to sleep in an empty apartment. So he came to the diner, just to be around other people even if he didn't talk to them. Trevor's expression had changed completely. The comedian's mask had slipped away, replaced by something more vulnerable and real. He asked Keanu what they talked about during those 2 hours. Keanu smiled softly and said they talked about everything and nothing. Richard's career as a teacher, his love of jazz music, his memories of New York in the 70s. They talked about loss and getting older, and the strange feeling of being surrounded by millions of people but still feeling completely alone. The audience was riveted. Some people had tears in their eyes. This wasn't entertainment in the traditional sense. This was something deeper, something that touched on experiences everyone in that room had felt at some point in their lives. Keanu continued, saying that his conversation with Richard wasn't unique. Over the past few years, he'd had similar experiences in different cities with different people. A young woman at a bus stop in Los Angeles who'd just moved to the city and didn't know anyone. A middle-aged guy at a coffee shop in Chicago who was going through a divorce and spending weekends alone for the first time in 20 years. A college student in Boston who was surrounded by classmates but felt invisible. Trevor interrupted gently, asking Keanu why he thought this was happening. Why were so many people feeling this way? Keanu paused, considering the question carefully. He said he didn't have all the answers, but he had some theories. Technology was part of it, he thought. Social media created an illusion of connection, while often making people feel more isolated. Everyone was curating perfect versions of their lives online, while struggling with loneliness in reality. But it was more than just technology, Keanu added. Modern life had become increasingly individualistic. People moved away from their families for jobs. Communities that used to gather in churches or community centers or neighborhood bars were disappearing. Everyone was busy rushing from one thing to the next, with no time to just sit and be present with another human being. Trevor shared his own experience then, and it was clear this conversation had touched something deep in him. He talked about moving to America from South Africa, about the strange isolation of being in a new country where everything was unfamiliar. He described the loneliness of those early years, working his way up in comedy, living in a tiny apartment, going days without having a real conversation with anyone. The two men sat there on national television, having the kind of honest, vulnerable conversation that rarely happens in public, let alone on a comedy show. The audience seemed to be holding its collective breath. This was no longer just an interview between a host and a celebrity guest. It had become something more intimate, more universal. Keanu leaned back in his chair and said something that would later become one of the most quoted moments from the interview. He said that loneliness had become an epidemic, but it was an invisible one. People could look fine on the outside, successful even, while suffering terribly on the inside. And the worst part was that loneliness made people feel ashamed, like there was something wrong with them for feeling that way, which made them less likely to reach out and connect with others. Trevor asked what Keanu thought could be done about it. Was this just the way things were now? Were people doomed to become more isolated as technology advanced and society changed? Keanu shook his head. He didn't believe that. He believed in human resilience and our fundamental need for connection. He believed that if people became aware of the problem, they could start making different choices. Then Keanu said something that made Trevor sit up straighter. He said he hadn't just been thinking about this problem. He'd been doing something about it. For the past 2 years, he'd been working on a project, something he'd kept quiet because he didn't want it to become about him or his celebrity. But he'd decided it was time to talk about it publicly, because the problem was too big to solve alone. The audience was completely still now. Camera operators who usually moved around to get different angles stood frozen in place. The studio felt charged with anticipation. Trevor asked the obvious question, what was the project? What had Keanu been doing? Keanu took a breath and started explaining. He'd been funding community centers in different cities across the country. Not fancy places, but simple, welcoming spaces where people could gather without any pressure or expectations. No membership fees, no religious affiliations, no agenda except human connection. Places where someone could walk in off the street and find other people to talk to, share a meal with, or just sit quietly alongside. He described how the centers worked. Each one had a large common area with comfortable seating, a kitchen where volunteers prepared simple meals, and various smaller rooms for activities. There were book clubs and art classes, game nights, and movie screenings. But the focus wasn't really on the activities themselves. The activities were just excuses for people to be in the same space, to interact, to remember what it felt like to connect with others face to face. Trevor was visibly moved. He asked how many centers Keanu had created. The answer was 7 so far, spread across different cities. Keanu had been working with local community organizers in each place, people who understood the specific needs of their neighborhoods. He provided the funding and the framework, but the communities shaped each center to fit their own character. The most interesting part, Keanu explained, was that these centers operated with a few simple rules. No phones in the common areas, no talking about work or money, no trying to impress anyone or compete for status. Just people being present with other people without all the usual social armor and performance. Trevor asked why Keanu had kept this project secret for so long. Why not use his fame to draw attention to it, to inspire others to create similar spaces? Keanu's answer was thoughtful and revealing. He said he'd been afraid that celebrity involvement would change the nature of the centers. He didn't want them to become tourist attractions or places people went hoping to spot someone famous. He wanted them to be genuine community spaces where people felt safe to be vulnerable and real. But recently, Keanu had started to reconsider. He'd realized that while the 7 centers were helping thousands of people, the problem was so much bigger. Millions of people were struggling with loneliness and isolation. If talking about the project publicly could inspire others to create similar spaces in their own communities, maybe the sacrifice of anonymity was worth it. The camera caught Trevor wiping his eyes. He wasn't trying to hide it or play it off as a joke. He just let himself feel whatever he was feeling in that moment. The audience started applauding, slowly at first, then building to something powerful. But Keanu looked almost uncomfortable with the attention. He held up his hand, asking everyone to stop clapping. He said that's exactly what he'd been worried about. He didn't want praise or recognition. He wanted action. He wanted people to understand that they didn't need money or fame to make a difference. Every person watching could do something, starting today, to help combat the loneliness epidemic. It didn't require building centers or starting organizations. It just required being willing to truly see other people and connect with them. Trevor nodded, understanding what Keanu was saying. But he could also see that what Keanu had created was significant and worth acknowledging. The interview had reached a turning point, and neither man seemed quite sure where it would go from here. There was a moment of silence on the stage. Trevor seemed to be wrestling with how to continue the conversation. You could see him making a decision in real time, choosing to go somewhere deeper. He leaned forward and asked Keanu a question that hadn't been prepared, wasn't on any list the producers had created. He asked where this all came from, what had happened in Keanu's life to make him care so deeply about loneliness and human connection. Keanu went very still. The easy conversational tone shifted slightly. Everyone in the audience could sense that something significant was about to happen. Keanu looked down at his hands for a moment, then back up at Trevor. He said that was a good question, one he'd been thinking about a lot while deciding whether to do this interview. He started by saying that his life hadn't always looked like what people imagined when they thought of a movie star's life. Yes, he'd been successful and fortunate in his career, but he'd also experienced profound loss. His father left when he was young. His closest friend died in a car accident decades ago. He'd lost a child, lost the mother of that child shortly after. These weren't things he talked about in interviews, but they were the experiences that had shaped who he was. Trevor didn't interrupt. Neither did anyone else. Keanu wasn't speaking dramatically or looking for sympathy. He was just being honest about his life in a way that felt almost matter-of-fact, though you could hear the emotion underneath the calm exterior. Keanu said that grief had taught him something crucial about human nature. When you're going through the worst moments of your life, the thing that saves you isn't success or money or fame. It's connection. It's the people who sit with you in the darkness without trying to fix anything or offer empty platitudes. It's the friend who shows up at your door with food. The stranger who sees you crying on a bench and asks if you're okay. The person who just holds space for your pain without judgment. He described the years after his greatest losses as a kind of wilderness. He kept working because that's what he knew how to do, but inside he felt hollowed out. What kept him going were small moments of genuine human connection. A conversation with a crew member on set who'd also lost a child. A letter from a fan who shared their own story of grief. running into someone on the street who needed help and being able to provide it. These experiences taught him that connection wasn't just nice to have. It was essential to survival, and if he'd needed it so desperately during his darkest times, he figured other people probably did too. That's when he started paying more attention to loneliness in the world around him. Once you started looking for it, it was everywhere. Trevor's eyes were definitely wet now. He thanked Keanu for sharing something so personal, then shared his own connection to loss and isolation. He talked about losing his stepfather, about the complicated relationship they'd had, about grieving someone you had mixed feelings about. He talked about the specific loneliness of being a public figure, where you're surrounded by people all the time, but most of them want something from you or see you as a character rather than a real person. The conversation had become incredibly intimate. It was the kind of exchange you might have with a close friend late at night, not on national television. But somehow that made it more powerful. Thousands of people in the audience and millions watching at home were witnessing two people being genuinely vulnerable with each other. Keanu said this was exactly why he'd created the community centers, because everyone needed spaces where they could be real, where the usual social masks could come off, where loss and struggle and loneliness weren't things to hide, but things that could be shared and witnessed by others. He told a story about one of the centers, the one in Philadelphia. There was a man who started coming about a year ago. Never said much, just sat in the corner reading or sometimes playing chess by himself. The volunteers would greet him, make sure he had coffee or tea, but didn't push him to engage beyond what he was comfortable with. After about 3 months, he started playing chess with other people. After 6 months, he began joining conversations. After a year, he told one of the volunteers that the center had saved his life. He'd been planning to end things, had felt completely invisible and disconnected from the world. But having a place to go, being welcomed without pressure, gradually gave him a reason to keep going. The audience was completely silent except for occasional sniffles. This wasn't the kind of story you usually heard on late-night television. Trevor asked if Keanu had met this man personally. Keanu nodded and said yes. They'd talked at length during one of his visits to the Philadelphia Center. The man didn't know who Keanu was at first, just thought he was another volunteer. When he eventually recognized him, he was initially embarrassed, but Keanu assured him that his story mattered more than any movie either of them had seen. Trevor asked what they'd talked about. Keanu smiled slightly and said they'd talked about chess mostly, about how the game taught patience and strategy, about how every move mattered, but they'd also talked about hope, about the strange unpredictability of life, about how you never really knew what small thing might make the difference between giving up and keeping going. This led to Keanu explaining the philosophy behind the centers. He'd worked with psychologists and community organizers to understand what actually helped people combat loneliness. The research was clear. Humans needed regular, low-pressure social interaction. They needed to feel useful and valued. They needed spaces where they could be themselves without performing or competing, and they needed these things to be accessible, free, and ongoing rather than one-time events. So the centers were designed around these principles. Anyone could walk in at any time during operating hours. There was always someone there to welcome newcomers. There were regular activities, but participation was optional. You could come just to sit in the presence of other people if that's all you needed. The only requirement was basic respect for others in the space. Trevor asked about funding. How long could Keanu sustain these centers? What happened when his money ran out? Keanu said this was actually part of why he decided to go public. Each center cost about $200,000 a year to operate, which included rent, utilities, staff salaries, and programming. He could fund that indefinitely for the existing 7 centers, but his hope was that others would get inspired to create similar spaces in their own communities. The model was replicable, he explained. You didn't need a celebrity donor. Communities could fundraise, apply for grants, or find local philanthropists who cared about the issue. The important thing was the intention and the design. Keep it simple, keep it welcoming, keep it focused on connection rather than programming or services. Trevor sat back, taking all of this in. He looked at Keanu with an expression of deep respect. Then he asked a question that seemed to surprise even himself. He asked if Keanu still struggled with loneliness, even with all the work he was doing to help others with the same problem. Keanu didn't hesitate. He said yes, absolutely. Fame and success didn't make you immune to loneliness. In some ways, they made it worse because you could be in a room full of people and still feel isolated. The centers helped him too. When he visited them, when he connected with people there, he felt less alone. It reminded him that everyone was fighting some kind of battle. Everyone needed connection. And there was something powerful about being part of a community working toward the same goal. He talked about how the volunteers at the centers often said they got more out of the experience than the people they were helping. That's how connection worked. It wasn't a one-way street where some people gave and others received. Everyone was both giving and receiving at the same time. Trevor mentioned something he'd noticed in the entertainment industry. So many people seemed to be struggling with mental health, addiction, and isolation despite having achieved conventional success. Did Keanu think the problem was particularly acute among people in the public eye? Keanu thought about it and said yes and no. Yes, because fame created specific challenges around authenticity and trust. When you were well known, it was hard to know if people liked you for yourself or for your status. That made genuine connection more difficult. But no, because loneliness was universal. A famous person and a factory worker could feel equally isolated for different reasons. The specific circumstances varied, but the core human need for connection was the same. What mattered more than the cause of loneliness, Keanu said, was the solution. And the solution was always the same. Show up for each other. Be present. Be genuine. Create spaces and opportunities for real human interaction. Stop performing and start connecting. The conversation had been going on for much longer than a typical interview segment. The producers were probably having a heart attack, worrying about how to fit this into the show's format. But nobody signaled for Trevor to wrap it up. This was clearly something special happening in real time. And everyone understood that some things were more important than running times and commercial breaks. Trevor asked one more question before they had to take a break. He asked what gave Keanu hope. With everything he'd experienced and observed, with all the loneliness and isolation in the world, what made him believe things could get better? Keanu smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached his eyes. He said what gave him hope was how little it took to make a difference. One conversation, one moment of real connection, one person deciding to look up from their phone and see the human being next to them. These small acts rippled outward in ways you couldn't predict or measure. The man in Philadelphia who'd been saved by having somewhere to go had now become a volunteer himself, helping welcome others who walked through the door. That's how change happened, one person at a time, one connection at a time. The audience burst into applause again, but this time Keanu didn't try to stop them. He just nodded, acknowledging their response. Trevor said they needed to take a commercial break, but when they came back, Keanu was going to share something that would challenge everyone watching. The cameras cut, but the energy in the studio remained electric. During the commercial break, something interesting happened in the studio. Normally, the audience would chat among themselves, check their phones, or stretch their legs. But after what they'd just witnessed, people sat quietly in their seats. Some were wiping their eyes. Others were just staring at the stage, processing what they'd heard. The crew members moved around doing their jobs, but you could see they were affected too. This wasn't just another day at work. Trevor and Keanu sat on stage talking quietly. The cameras weren't rolling, so nobody could hear what they were saying, but their body language suggested a continued depth of conversation. When the stage manager counted down from 10, signaling they were about to go live again, both men straightened up and composed themselves, but there was something different about them now. The host-guest dynamic had shifted into something more like a partnership. The cameras came back on. Trevor welcomed everyone back and reminded viewers what they'd been discussing. He said that what they'd heard so far was profound, but Keanu had promised to share something that would challenge everyone watching. Trevor gestured to his guest, giving him the floor. Keanu looked directly into the camera. This wasn't the usual way guests on talk shows behaved. Normally, they'd focus on the host, playing to them and letting the cameras capture the conversation. But Keanu was addressing the audience at home, the millions of people watching from their living rooms and bedrooms and wherever else. It was intimate and direct, in a way that felt almost uncomfortable, but in a good way. He said he wanted to propose something. Not as a celebrity or as someone with answers, but as a fellow human being who'd struggled with loneliness and disconnection. He called it the 1-hour present challenge. The idea was simple. Once a week, for 1 hour, spend time with another person without any digital distractions. No phones, no computers, no tablets, just two people being present with each other. It could be anyone, Keanu explained. A family member, a friend, a neighbor, a coworker. It could even be a stranger if both people were comfortable with that. The point wasn't who you spent the hour with. The point was the quality of presence you brought to that hour. Really seeing the other person. Really listening. Being fully there instead of half distracted by notifications and messages and the constant pull of the digital world. Trevor asked what people should do during that hour. Did it need to be a structured activity? Keanu shook his head. It could be anything or nothing. Take a walk, share a meal, play a game, work on a project together, or just sit and talk. What mattered wasn't the activity, but the attention, the willingness to be fully present with another human being for 60 minutes. He acknowledged that this might sound simple, maybe even easy, but he challenged anyone watching to think about the last time they'd actually done this. When was the last time you spent an hour with someone without checking your phone even once? Without your attention drifting to work emails or social media, or the mental to-do list running in the background? For most people, he said, it had probably been a long time, maybe years. The thing was, Keanu continued, an hour wasn't a huge commitment. Everyone could find 1 hour a week. It wasn't about having time. It was about making time, about deciding that human connection mattered enough to prioritize it. If you could binge watch a show for 3 hours or scroll social media for countless hours each week, you could carve out 60 minutes for genuine presence with another person. Trevor was nodding along. He admitted that Keanu was right. Even though his job involved talking to people every day, those conversations were performative. They had a purpose, an audience, a structure. When was the last time he'd just hung out with someone without any agenda? He couldn't remember. Keanu said that was exactly the problem. Modern life had made everything transactional. We networked instead of making friends. We scheduled quality time instead of just being together. We optimized and multitasked our way through relationships, always half present, always thinking about the next thing. The 1 hour present challenge was about pushing back against all of that. He shared another story, this one from his own recent experience. A few weeks earlier, he'd been in Los Angeles and called up an old friend he hadn't seen in over a year. They'd been meaning to get together but kept putting it off because schedules were complicated and life was busy. So Keanu just showed up at his friend's house unannounced with 2 sandwiches and said they were going to sit in the backyard for an hour with no phones. His friend was surprised, maybe a little thrown off by the spontaneity of it. But they did it. They sat outside, ate their sandwiches, and talked. About nothing important at first, the weather, recent movies they'd seen. But gradually the conversation went deeper. His friend admitted he'd been struggling with some things at work, feeling undervalued and uncertain about his career direction. Keanu shared his own doubts and fears about aging in an industry obsessed with youth. They laughed about old memories and acknowledged how much they'd both changed over the years. By the end of that hour, Keanu said, he felt more connected and energized than he had in months. It wasn't complicated or expensive or difficult. It was just 2 people being present with each other. And it mattered. Trevor asked what happened if you didn't have someone obvious to spend that hour with. What if you were new to a city or had lost touch with old friends or just genuinely didn't have people in your life? Keanu said that was actually part of the challenge. It might require courage to reach out to someone, to admit you wanted to connect. But that vulnerability was important. He suggested starting small. Invite a coworker for coffee after work. Ask a neighbor if they want to take a walk. Join a local group or club and actually talk to people there instead of just showing up and leaving. The community centers he'd created were specifically designed to make this easier, but they weren't necessary. Every neighborhood had places where people could gather. Parks, libraries, coffee shops, community centers. The infrastructure for connection already existed. People just needed to use it intentionally. Then Keanu said something that really landed. He said loneliness was partly a choice. Not the loneliness that came from circumstances beyond your control, like losing someone or moving somewhere new, but the ongoing loneliness that came from never reaching out, never being vulnerable, never prioritizing connection. That kind of loneliness was a choice, even if it didn't feel like one. This could have come across as harsh or judgmental, but somehow Keanu said it with such compassion that it felt more like an invitation than an accusation. He was including himself in the statement. We all made that choice sometimes, choosing comfort or familiarity or the path of least resistance over the risk of genuine connection. Trevor picked up on this and asked about the fear factor. Because that's what it really was, wasn't it? Fear of rejection, fear of vulnerability, fear of being seen as needy or weird. These fears kept people isolated even when they desperately wanted connection. Keanu agreed completely. He said he still felt that fear himself. Every time he walked into one of the community centers, part of him worried about how he'd be received, whether he'd say the wrong thing, whether people would be weird about his fame. But he did it anyway because connection was worth the risk. He offered some practical advice for managing that fear. Start with low-stakes interactions. Smile at people. Make small talk with the barista or the cashier. Compliment someone genuinely. These tiny moments of connection built confidence and reminded you that most people were actually happy to engage. The cultural narrative that everyone was too busy and bothered to talk to strangers wasn't really true. Most people were just as lonely and hungry for connection as you were. Trevor asked about the hashtag Keanu had mentioned earlier. He wanted everyone to be able to follow along and share their experiences. Keanu suggested 1 hour present. Simple and clear. People could share their stories of taking the challenge, what they did during their hour, how it made them feel. The idea was to create a movement, a collective reminder that connection mattered. Then Trevor did something unexpected. He made a commitment right there on air. He said he would do the 1 hour present challenge himself, and he'd report back to his audience about the experience. Not as a bit or a segment, but as a genuine personal commitment. He encouraged everyone watching to do the same. The audience started applauding again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't applause for a performance or a touching moment. It was applause of agreement, of commitment, of people deciding collectively to try something different. Keanu looked pleased but also serious. He said the applause was nice, but what really mattered was follow-through. It was easy to feel inspired in the moment and then forget about it once the show ended and regular life resumed. The challenge was to actually do it, to put it on your calendar, to reach out to someone, to show up and be present. He acknowledged that 1 hour a week wouldn't solve all problems. It wouldn't cure clinical depression or heal trauma or fix broken relationships. But it was a start. It was a way of pushing back against the epidemic of loneliness, of saying that human connection mattered enough to prioritize it. Trevor asked if there were any rules beyond no phones and 1 hour of presence. Keanu said, no, not really. The whole point was to keep it simple and accessible. If people wanted to make it more formal or structured, they could. But the basic invitation was just to be present with another human being for 60 minutes once a week. The interview was winding down now. You could feel the energy in the room beginning to shift, moving from the intensity of the conversation toward some kind of resolution. Trevor thanked Keanu for his honesty and vulnerability, for sharing both his work and his personal experiences. He said the interview had affected him deeply, and he suspected it would affect many people watching. Keanu thanked Trevor for creating space for a real conversation. He said talk shows didn't usually allow for this kind of depth, and he appreciated the willingness to let the interview go where it needed to go, rather than sticking to a predetermined script. As they stood to shake hands, the audience rose to their feet. It wasn't the usual standing ovation that talk shows sometimes prompted, or that audiences gave out of politeness. This felt earned and genuine. People were standing because they'd witnessed something rare and valuable. A moment of real human connection, broadcast to millions that challenged everyone watching to examine their own lives and choices. The cameras pulled back to show the full scene. Trevor and Keanu still shaking hands and exchanging words the microphones couldn't pick up. The audience on their feet, many with tears streaming down their faces. The crew members watching from the sides equally moved. It was a powerful image, a reminder of what was possible when people chose vulnerability over performance. As they cut to commercial, nobody in the studio moved. They all stood there suspended in the moment, knowing they'd just been part of something that mattered. The interview aired that night, and within 30 minutes, the internet exploded. But it wasn't the usual social media frenzy that followed celebrity appearances. There were no memes making fun of awkward moments. No clips taken out of context to generate outrage. Instead, something unusual was happening. People were actually talking about what had been said. The hashtag 1HourPresent started trending worldwide within 2 hours. But what made it different from most trending topics was the nature of the posts. People weren't just sharing the video clip or commenting on the interview. They were sharing their own stories. A woman in Seattle wrote about having dinner with her elderly neighbor who she'd never really talked to before. A college student in Florida described calling his grandmother and just listening to her stories for an hour. A single dad in Texas posted about putting his phone away and playing board games with his kids. The stories kept coming. Thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. People from every continent, every background, every age group. Each one describing their version of the 1HourPresent challenge. Some were simple and quiet. Others were profound and life-changing. But they all shared a common thread. The hour had mattered. The connection had made a difference. Trevor Noah stayed up late that night reading through the posts. He'd been doing his show for years and had conducted hundreds of interviews. Some had gone viral, some had made news, but none had sparked this kind of response. The next morning, he tweeted about his own experience with the challenge. He'd spent an hour with one of his writers, someone he'd worked with for 3 years but never really knew beyond their professional relationship. They'd gone to a park, sat on a bench, and just talked. No agenda, no work discussion. Just two people being present with each other. In his tweet, Trevor admitted it had been uncomfortable at first. They'd both struggled with the urge to check their phones, to fill silences with scrolling instead of just sitting with the quiet moments. But by the end of the hour, he felt like he'd made a genuine friend rather than just having a coworker. The writer later posted their own account of the experience, saying it had reminded them why they'd gotten into comedy in the first place. Not for the jokes or the attention, but for the human connection that came from shared laughter and honest conversation. The community centers Keanu had created were overwhelmed with visitors in the days following the interview. The one in Philadelphia had to extend its hours because so many people were showing up. Volunteers reported conversations with people who'd been watching the interview and felt compelled to check out these spaces for themselves. Many admitted they'd been lonely for years but hadn't known how to reach out or where to go. The man Keanu had mentioned, the one who'd been saved by having somewhere to go, found himself becoming something of a local ambassador for the center. People would come in asking about him, wanting to hear his story. At first he was overwhelmed and uncomfortable with the attention. But gradually he realized that his willingness to be vulnerable, to let Keanu share his story on national television, was helping others feel less alone. That gave his struggle meaning in a way he'd never expected. Something else interesting started happening. People began creating their own community spaces modeled after Keanu's centers. A group of friends in Portland rented a small storefront and turned it into a drop-in center for connection. A church in Atlanta repurposed their basement into a phones-free gathering space. A library in Denver started hosting regular present hours, where people could come just to talk to each other, without any structured programming. These grassroots efforts weren't coordinated or organized by any central authority. They were just people who'd watched the interview and decided to do something. Within a month, over 50 new community spaces had opened across the country. Some were large and well-funded. Others were tiny operations run out of someone's living room or a corner of a local coffee shop. But they all shared the same basic principle. Create space for people to connect without pressure or performance. The media tried to turn it into a typical celebrity story. Entertainment shows wanted to focus on Keanu's generosity and philanthropy. News programs wanted to analyze the loneliness epidemic and debate whether technology was to blame. But Keanu refused most interview requests. He released a simple statement saying that this wasn't about him and never had been. The story was about human connection and what people were doing in their own communities. He encouraged media outlets to focus on the grassroots efforts and the individuals taking the challenge seriously, rather than on him. This only made people respect him more. In an age where celebrities branded everything and monetized every cause, Keanu's genuine desire to stay out of the spotlight felt revolutionary. He'd sparked something and then stepped back, trusting people to carry it forward on their own. Trevor continued following the story on his show, but he did it thoughtfully. Instead of bringing on experts to analyze the phenomenon, he shared regular updates about how the challenge was spreading. He interviewed ordinary people who were creating community spaces or who'd had meaningful experiences with the 1 hour present challenge. He kept bringing the focus back to the personal and the practical, rather than the abstract or theoretical. One particularly moving segment featured a woman in her 70s who'd been widowed for 5 years. She described how loneliness had slowly consumed her life after her husband died. Her children lived far away, her friends had their own families and busy lives, and she'd spent most days alone in her house. After watching the Keanu interview, she'd gathered her courage and went to a local park with a sign that said, "1 hour present. Want to talk?" She felt ridiculous holding the sign, certain nobody would approach her. But someone did. A young man in his 20s, dealing with his own struggles with anxiety and social isolation, sat down next to her. They talked for an hour, then another hour, then exchanged numbers and agreed to meet again the following week. 6 weeks later, they'd become genuine friends despite their age difference. She'd helped him navigate some difficult family dynamics. He'd helped her learn how to use social media to connect with her grandchildren. Their friendship had expanded both of their worlds. Stories like this one weren't isolated incidents. They were happening everywhere. The interview had given people permission to be vulnerable, to admit they were lonely, to reach out to strangers and ask for connection. That permission was powerful because it normalized something that had been treated as shameful or weak. Schools started incorporating the 1 hour present concept into their programs. Teachers reported that students were more engaged and empathetic when they practiced putting away devices and being fully present with each other. Some schools created weekly connection hours where students could gather for unstructured social time without phones or screens. Workplaces began experimenting with the idea too. A tech company in Silicon Valley instituted Present Fridays, where employees were encouraged to spend their lunch hour in genuine conversation rather than working through meals at their desks. A hospital in Boston created a staff lounge with a no-phones policy where doctors, nurses, and support staff could decompress together. These weren't mandatory programs with forced participation. They were simply spaces and opportunities for connection, and people responded enthusiastically. The academic community took notice as well. Researchers who'd been studying loneliness and social isolation for years suddenly had a massive real-world experiment unfolding. They began tracking the effects of the 1 hour present challenge, conducting surveys and interviews with participants. The preliminary findings were striking. People reported feeling less lonely, more connected to their communities, and more optimistic about their lives.